Welcome to our second 2024 Crafting Support Project Family webinar. I'm Dr. Julie McCarthy, and I'm a clinical psychologist and researcher at McLean Hospital. I'm so pleased to be here with all of you tonight to speak on crafting skills for families. Okay, so first up, for those of you who are new to us, or for those who have been with us before, we'll do a quick review of what the Crafting Support Project is and what brings us all together today. Then I'll go through a bit of a discussion on craft skills and common dilemmas, really born out of the work that we've done last year, talking about some of the different craft skills and how over the course of talking to many families, there are certain similar situations that people have that can be tough to troubleshoot. And so we'll talk about how to apply some of those craft skills to those situations. And then I'll go over some resources and have time for a Q&A. And then I'll end with some closing remarks. All right, so before we jump into the Crafting Support Project, I'm going to see if we could get a little bit of information from folks about who is here with us today. So I'm going to launch a poll just asking what best describes your role. As a family member, a person with lived experience with mental health challenges, clinician, none of the above, multiple intersecting roles or identities. Feel free to choose more than one, and we'll leave this up for a few seconds to let folks share if they'd like. And then we'll see what is most common for tonight. All right, so we'll close the poll in 3, 2, 1. And it looks like we have majority family members. Hopefully you all can see that on your screen. So we have 96% family members joining us today. And then also we have folks who might identify as none of the above, and also at least a couple folks with lived experience with mental health challenges or conditions themselves. So thank you so much for sharing. All right, so let's see. First of all, we have this seminar series really geared toward family members, but also clinicians, friends, people with lived experience themselves with mental health, but really to highlight family here, especially today when we're talking about crafting skills for families, because families are pretty important in the course of care. Why specifically? Families can be the people who first notice sometimes that something's a little bit different, or maybe someone needs help. Or maybe that person in our lives really needs help. They know it, but it's tough to connect to or gather that energy or resources to connect with care. And so family members can be extremely key when identifying care options, helping to assist with appointments, getting to appointments, maybe attending appointments with folks, or giving someone space to do that on their own, and they might help in other ways. So there can be a lot of instrumental support for families. Another thing that's useful to consider, and really why it's best practice to include families whenever there is a healthy relationship present, is because having more warmth and positive affect in a family is associated with less relapse for folks who, I work with a lot, people who have experienced with psychosis. And everyone, you could probably agree that they probably want to spend less time in the hospital, as much as I love McLean. And we also really get feedback from people about how supportive families are in terms of one's own general well-being. Even though people may not express it all the time, we definitely hear folks who say how meaningful it's been to have their family by their side, whether it's in the hospital, outpatient, generally navigating life, that it really goes a long way for people. And fortunately, many folks, certainly not everyone, has contact or opportunity for contact with family, whether it's living with them, living nearby, or certainly with the use of technology that we have, with video conferencing, Zoom, phone calls, texting, and emails, et cetera. All right, however, that being said, sure, there are some scenarios where families are kind of considered part of the treatment team with the loved one, leading the charge, and other providers as part of the treatment team meeting different needs. However, this doesn't always happen, and there can be lots of reasons for that. And so that's part of the reason why we have this webinar, so people can get skills and support, even if they may not be allowed to or invited in to be part of that conversation all the time. It's something that could happen down the road, But in the meantime, there are still things that you are able to do to support yourself and your loved one. So that's where community reinforcement and family training, at least as I've adapted it most recently in my research for early psychosis and substance use, has come into play. And originally this was developed by Dr. Robert Myers at the University of New Mexico. And we have a working relationship with his group. And the topics that we discuss are things like motivation and self-care, communication skills, functional analysis, kind of putting ourselves in our loved ones' shoes to understand why they do what they do or don't do, and positive reinforcement, treatment engagement, allowing for natural consequences, or really empowering our loved ones' independence, problem solving, and a bit of a review and next steps. So what we found so far from our research study on craft for early psychosis is that this approach can be really feasible for people. We offer it in an 8-session format. Everyone who completed or started our pilot, completed our pilot coaching, everyone found it quite acceptable, would recommend it to others, and it was easily delivered via telehealth, really reducing some of those barriers to getting access to care. And then we show that it improves family well-being, reduces depression and anxiety and stress, improves relationship happiness and personal happiness. And some of the feedback that we've gotten have been things like, we've all had this experience where we do it kind of wrong in their eyes, and that usually creates a blow up. And I think role playing helps us get comfortable so that we can try these things in a way that will be productive. And another family or several families have said, may not be true for everyone, but that this program has really been life-changing for them to really see how much the change that they make in what they say or how they support their loved one can really make them feel worlds better. All right, so where does that lead to our crafting support project family services? Well, we learned that not everyone's eligible for our research study, and most people do want support anyway. And so we were fortunate to receive philanthropy support to provide a set of services for families beyond the research study. So as you all know, being here today, we have our webinar series, Thursdays, 5 to 6 p.m. We just had our first one last month. If you missed it, it was how to partner with law enforcement. That will be on YouTube later this year. And we have monthly webinars through November, ending with our family recovery night, sharing stories of hope from lived experience with people who have psychosis or other mental health conditions, and their family member perspectives as well. However, for last year, we actually spent a lot of time focusing on specific craft skills, in addition to other evidence-based skills as well. So if you're interested, feel free to check out those videos online. And we also offer, as the other arm of the Crafting Support Project, one-on-one coaching. Right now, this is limited to family members at McLean who are having a loved one in, or in the past, having come through our Division of Psychotic Disorders. And this can offer up to 8 weekly one-on-one sessions for a coach. If you're not eligible to get that through one of our research initiatives, it's on Zoom, no cost to you. If you're interested, feel free to get in touch with me at jmccarthy@mclean.harvard.edu. And so where does this fit into our larger plans? So we started with our research project. We're now offering these educational services, and we're trying to assess how could this be sustainable in the long run, and starting to explore whether we might be able to offer this type of one-on-one or group coaching based in craft skills as a clinical service. So we'll let you know as our information develops there. All right, so now we're going to switch gears and talk about our topic for tonight, which is craft skills and common dilemmas. So first up, what if my relative won't talk to me? So interestingly, a lot of folks might come into coaching with us and say that they, as family members, are walking on eggshells, talking or trying to talk to their relatives. However, sometimes they feel like no matter what they say or do, they're not really getting much back, or maybe their relative is hiding away in their room somewhere and doesn't really interact with the family much. So what can we do there? Well, talking is in the title of this dilemma. So certainly the communication skill is front of mind. And not just the specific communication skills per se, but really thinking about how can we think about some of the general communication skills, going back to some of these basics here, about when you and your relative are at your best. So for instance, if someone's coming to try to talk to me and I'm in the middle of doing a webinar right now, I'm not going to have the time or attention to attend to somebody else and their needs. And so we can similarly think about past attempts to talk with a relative, what was going on at the time? Maybe you were feeling, bright and chipper at your best. Maybe your relative was tired or they had something else on their mind, or maybe they weren't in the best mood to talk. And so for yourselves, you can start to think about, well, when are you and your relative at their best, and try to find a little bit of overlap if possible and choose the time that might make the best sense to broach that conversation. The next point is about how we can think about what is your priority goal, or the one thing, if you could only get one thing out of the conversation, what that goal would be. So what I mean by that is it something that you want to share or express, like information or just your perspective or opinion on something? Or is it a request that you're trying to make from someone else? Because at the end of the day, sometimes people can feel very overwhelmed by all the things that family members want to talk about. And if you're in a situation like this persistently, you might find that you have a laundry list of things adding up that you want to talk about because you haven't felt like you've had the opportunity. What happens though is if we give all of that to our relative at once, it can inadvertently, decrease the likelihood that they would want to talk to us again. And so instead, we can really focus in on, well, when push comes to shove, what do we want as the one main target to talk about, so that we can broach some of those other topics later. And then we can also think about, sure, what specific communication skills could help. So for instance, some of the communication skills that might be appropriate here are, one, being brief. Certainly goes in line with the idea of staying with your eyes on the prize of like that one goal that you want to focus on. But also it refers to just the amount of content that you're saying in a conversation. So if you wanted to talk about, for instance, the topic of treatment engagement, a brief way to go about that might be something like, hey, you mentioned that talking to a therapist wouldn't be helpful. What might be more helpful right now? Instead of going in to try to convince them that this is like the best idea in the world, just ending with an open-ended question, seeing how they respond can give you a sense of how much it makes sense to continue the conversation or maybe wait for a better time. The second specific skill is be positive. So if we're, as a family member, thinking, oh, my relative won't talk to me, what kind of feelings might you have? Maybe frustration, maybe anger, maybe resentment in some ways. And so it can be really easy to fall more into the negative there. So instead, practicing being a bit positive to kind of reinforce them wanting to be around us a little bit more, we could use something, when we do see them in passing, even like, it's nice to see you. Or if they share something with you, even if it's not much, like an update about how they're feeling, or maybe going to an appointment or why they didn't go to an appointment, just thanking them for sharing that information with you at all can be helpful. And then the next is use understanding statements. So this can apply, especially if they don't want to talk to you, or maybe you're having a conversation and they choose to end it. You can say, instead of like, well, we really need to talk about this at some point, or, well, that's not fair, I still want to talk about this. This is really important to me. We can just say something to meet them where they're at, like, thanks for letting me know, now's not a great time. Hopefully we can catch up later this week. As much as we'd want to have this conversation now, or maybe yesterday, we can't control what other people say or do. What we can do is think about what is the most effective choice for us in that situation. Another specific skill we can use here is take partial responsibility. And this is not in any way taking responsibility for your relative's choice to do or not do something related to treatment or their substance use or their job or school, but really taking partial responsibility in your role in the interactions that you've had with them. So for instance, say there was a situation where maybe your loved one's not talking to you because they weren't very happy with something that you had to say to them yesterday. One way you could respond to that is apologizing briefly. I'm sorry, I was trying to tell you what to do. Share your intention. I want it to be helpful. And didn't ask if you wanted help before giving you advice. That's the taking partial responsibility part of trying to give advice when it may not have been asked for or well received. And then you can ask an open-ended questioning or sort of a gatekeeping question. Would you like to talk about it? Yes or no, which would then open up further conversation if they're up for having it. Other things that we can think about here are from a functional analysis standpoint in craft, helping to understand where our loved one is coming from. So thinking about, well, what might your loved one be thinking or feeling before maybe ignoring an attempt at communication or ending it prematurely? Maybe they're concerned about being judged. Maybe they're really tired. Maybe they are anxious or upset about how something's gone in the past and they're not anticipating it going well in the future. And then we can also start to pay attention to, well, if they're not talking with us, well, what are they doing instead? And that can start to give us clues about what's important to them. Or you could talk about what's important to them too. Because remember, with this dilemma, what if my relative won't talk to me? It kind of has in the connotation that we as a family member are bringing our agenda to the table. Just as important, though, is understanding what matters most to your relative. And so trying to find common ground, but that can feel more collaborative rather than top down, you must talk to me. Another skill here that we can use is positive reinforcement. We kind of touched on that with the being positive in the communication. We can also think about this as a mindset or an approach, trying to intentionally look for what they are doing well, how you can reward them, and what you can do to discuss or what you can do or discuss to invest in your relationship bank. Because sometimes if we've got a loved one with a mental health or substance use concern, I really think it's all kind of under a similar umbrella, we might be very focused on what's not done yet, what's not going well, what could be better. So if all the conversations tend to be around those things, that could be really stressful for any of us. And so instead, trying to demonstrate that it's safe to talk to us and we're not going to ask you to do something every time, we're not going to give you a critique every time, can really help in the relationship bank to reinforce just spending time together so that there are more opportunities to talk. And everyone's different here. So how you would reward that time together or time with communication, even if it's limited, might depend on the person. But sometimes that could even be giving your loved one space. Like they talk to you for a little bit. Okay, great. I'm going to let you initiate the next conversation rather than maybe try again and again in the same day to continue talking. Or it could be, hey, some praise or doing a favor for them. There are lots of different ways that you can show that you care and appreciate what they're doing to encourage the likelihood of it occurring again. Okay, so this is a little bit different. What if I keep asking for something with no result? So let's put in the chat for a moment, what are some examples of things that you may have asked for or wanted a loved one to do that you haven't seen change on yet, or maybe hadn't seen change in a while? You can feel free to put that in the chat now. Okay, so we've got things like brushing teeth. Consider seeing a therapist. Yes. Taking medication, studying for an upcoming exam. So things in a recovery area that someone might care about and also might have trouble working toward. Communication about what jobs they're applying to. Help with yard work. Scheduling appointments with PCP, eating dinner or not eating in the bedroom. So kind of being a bit more around family perhaps or in common spaces. Schedule a family therapy session. Yeah. Socializing, right? Kind of addressing that concern about isolation or loneliness, which we know can affect a lot of people. And just talking about how studying is going, period. Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing these wonderful examples and frustrating examples for family members, right? So some of the things that we can think about in terms of how to link craft skills to this situation is in a few ways. So one, the allowing for natural consequences section of craft would ask us to think about, well, what are we willing to allow someone to experience, what might happen if, let's say, there is no change in this particular area that we'd like to see change in, and is that a safe consequence to allow? Every family is a little bit different with that in terms of where they would draw that line. So we can start to ask ourselves, say if it's one of the examples like, all right, maybe helping with yard work or helping out with something around the house. This is a common one that comes up where we might be in a shared space with someone. We want them to be doing more than they're doing, and they might have other ideas or other priorities. And so are we willing to, let's say if this is an agreed upon task that they would take care of, that we would be okay with seeing the yard be less tidy than we would like, or the dishes not being put away, let's say. Are we okay personally allowing that to happen? If so, we might be able to allow that to occur. And, if the natural consequences are somewhat negative for that other family member, they might be more likely to change their behavior. However, if it's not a negative consequence for them, and if it's more of something that just concerns you or bothers you, that may not be something that, quote, has a natural consequence that makes sense to, sit back and do nothing about. If it would make you feel better to have that task done, it might make sense to reset expectations and either take care of that thing yourself or maybe use one of the other skills to deal with that. So we have problem solving. If this is something that, let's say, is something that you want to see changing, but you're not seeing changing yet, like scheduling one of those appointments, either with the PCP, family therapy session, et cetera, you can go into problem solving. So really kind of define, why is this a problem? Because just because someone's not scheduling an appointment doesn't mean they can or can't do it, or they really want to or don't want to. It kind of depends. So for you, we can start to think about, why is this a problem for you? And why is this a problem for you right now? And that will help you specify or define the problem so that you can best match up the appropriate solutions to the situation. So for instance, if someone's having a hard time scheduling an appointment that you think they genuinely want to make, then the solutions will probably involve things like reminders, maybe offering to do it together, or offering some specific times when you all might be available to meet so that they don't have to come up with the schedule from scratch. However, if the problem is actually they don't want to do this appointment, that's going to lead to a whole other set of potential solutions. Some that might involve communication skills. And so there we might think about, okay, communication, if I've already talked about maybe this being important, or maybe they've already said that they'll do something and they're not doing it, this might be the place to bring in the communication skill of be specific and clear. So if we say something like, hey, I would really appreciate if you do X, Y, or Z soon, if we're not really defining what soon is, soon in our mind might be today or tomorrow. For somebody else, it might mean, well, maybe in the next month or so, still this year, it'll get done. Being really on the same page about what the expectations are, or maybe even what some of the challenges are, can really help. And then also, we can think about our own motivation and self-care. In the absence of being able to really get someone else to help out with some of the tasks that you would like them to do, perhaps, or some of the responsibility, even of their own self-care, like, brushing their own teeth, for instance. What we can do is focus on what's in our sphere of influence, which is our own self-care. Because when we see the status quo continuing on with no results, that can be really stressful on us. And what we can do that can help improve this moment or situation for ourselves is really thinking about, what can we do to do something that we enjoy? Or self-care can also take the form of saying no to something. Like, instead of feeling like we need to take the burden on to do all of these things or manage all of these other people in the house or all of these household tasks, all of the treatment, logistics, maybe we can think about how much are we willing and able to provide to others, and how can we protect what we can for ourselves? And we'll talk about another dilemma in terms of self-care in just a moment. We also had a question in the chat about, is it unreasonable to get help around the house when we as parents are paying out of pocket a lot of money in living expenses each month? How would you ask for that help in a way that would be successful? Great question. So let me put this in the chat for our audience members to share their input, and then I'll share some thoughts as well. So what are some examples of ways that maybe you could talk about this concern with another family member in the house when you would like to ask them to contribute or help out? What comes to mind? Either if you've had success in that area or you have an idea of how this could go for another family, because every family is different. And I would also just like to validate that, of course, when we're doing so much for a loved one, a family member in our life, of course we want to be able to feel like we're appreciated in some ways, or maybe that we're not alone, and that in an ideal world, we would love to have them contribute as well. So one person says, develop pros and cons of spending money by hiring others versus saving money by doing it yourself. Yeah. So we can think about, all right, well, what's the agreement on the table with the relative, and help them think through, what the responsibilities are, and would they like to do some things themselves, or spend money to have someone else do some of those tasks for them. Another person shared, share specifically what you need help with, and maybe ask what chore they would like help with, and make a chart and post it. So that can serve a couple of purposes. One, being collaborative and giving options and kind of coming up with a solution together, versus, hey, here's this chore I'm assigning you, please do it. Why aren't you doing it? Because they never agreed to do it in the first place, perhaps. And then another person volunteered, you could ask them to join you in doing the task together. I've seen this happen in my own life where, doing something together feels like more of a teamwork situation, rather than feeling like the expectation is either on you or the other person to completely take care of something themselves, especially when they may not always see all of the work that you're doing on your own too, to help support them. Okay, thank you. Oh, and then let's see. Okay, another suggestion is, name that there are more of us in the house and ask for help with a specific task, or ask what they would like to contribute. Yeah, you can keep it open-ended, see what their ideas are. Because I think most people realize that it takes a little bit of effort to maintain, run, live in a household with shared space. Yeah, and I think great points. There are not always situations where people are living in the same house. And some of these options may work better for some people than others, which is definitely why it's always good to have options. And so with problem solving, for instance, we tend to come up with at least, 5, 6, 7, 8, up to 10 options or so. So there are some backup plans as well. And if people don't live in the house, you can start to think about, well, all right, what types of natural consequences might you be willing to allow if you are supporting the person in other areas? All right, so another dilemma that can come up for some people, say if you are parents of an adult child, or you have another family member that you're sharing caregiving responsibilities with for a third family member, what if the two of you are on different pages? So this one can go in a lot of different directions. I would like this to be a little bit of a pop quiz moment. Of some of the craft topics that we've mentioned so far, which types of topics or skills could apply here, where two people are on different pages about how to proceed? And just as a reminder, we've got your own self-care, communication skills, problem solving, allowing for natural consequences, positive reinforcement, treatment engagement sometimes could apply to lots of different situations. So what comes to mind? Okay, ask an expert. So that could be a treatment engagement conversation like, hey, if this is a common problem for us, we're often on different pages, we want to be on the same page, maybe asking an expert, whether that be an individual therapist or a couples therapist, family therapist, you could loop in a professional. What else could be a strategy here, even if it's not a specific craft skill? Better communication with the partner. Yeah, that can mean a lot of different things. Better communication in terms of maybe understanding where you're coming from, but also labeling your feelings or being very specific and clear about your needs and opinions or rationale as well. Another person says, clarify the goals that you're trying to achieve. Yes, going back to, well, okay, what's our target? What do we really care about? And also trying to find common ground about what that is. If it's, hey, I just want my loved one to be happy and healthy and independent, great. You might be on different pages about how to support a loved one to get there, but maybe that's something that you all have in common. Another person volunteered, ask the other parent or partner where they're coming from and how they feel. We might be very focused on the fact that they're not agreeing with us. Can't they see? We have the answer. Just, agree with us and let's make this happen. And so instead, shifting the focus on what's going on with the other person can feel tough sometimes if you feel like they should know, what we feel and see where we're coming from. But again, this goes back to what are we in control of, and eliciting that from our partner can be something that we can take the initiative with. Right. We also have some creative ideas too. You can communicate by talking about it. You can also write about it too. If you feel like it gets really heated in the moment, you can use pen and paper or texts or emails to clarify your thoughts or think about them ahead of time before sharing them. And then literally you could potentially get more on the same page and also compromise and take turns perhaps with different strategies. Another person says you can start by acknowledging a shared goal or belief and then sharing the basis for your thought process and asking them where they're coming from. So you're kind of eliciting both sides, and maybe you can start with where you're coming from so that the pressure is not all on the other person, and you're kind of modeling the type of communication about this that you'd like to see. Okay. And then someone else said they just had a Zoom meeting recently with their partner about options to address a problem with their son. Yes. So definitely encourage you to think about that. Sometimes it's tough to find moments to actually sit down and think about this. And so again, going back to the timing, trying to think about when it makes sense to have this conversation when you and your partner are at your best can help too. So thank you so much for all these wonderful ideas and suggestions. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears and talk about final dilemma before we take some time for some more resources, questions, and answers. And so what if it's hard to find time to take care of myself or yourself? So this is one that often comes up with family members. I'm not going to assume that it applies to everyone on this webinar tonight. But so some of the things that we can use from craft to address this dilemma is thinking about, well, what is it about building our own motivation and self-care that would help us carve out time or protect this time for ourselves? So first we can think about, well, what does this mean? What is self-care for you? It doesn't have to just be like, oh, I'm going to, exercise or eat well or catch up with friends. It can also be setting a boundary. It can be doing the hard task for work that can also be important to you and your values and decrease stress later because that task is done. It can be all types of things. And then you can ask yourself, well, why is it important? Sometimes we think, gosh, I've got to do this self-care activity because I should, because maybe my doctor is telling me to do it or society is telling me to do it. And at the end of the day, we only have 24 hours, each day. So we can think, well, of your priorities, why is this one important to you? And even just reflecting on it, saying it out loud or writing it down can reinforce for yourself that this matters to you. You matter and you deserve to have time for yourself. And then you can also start to think if there were times in your life where self-care was more prevalent or existed, you can think about, well, what have you done in the past that you would like to do now? So, okay, what would I want to revive, bring back into my life or routine? We can also think ahead. What is something new that you want to try? Maybe you've always wanted to try like a dance class, or maybe you've really wanted to try a new job. It could be all types of things. And starting to imagine, give yourself a really open-ended permission to think about what self-care means for you can help you get started. Another thing, even though it's the word is focusing on yourself, communication can be a craft skill that can come into play here. What I mean by that is when we start to make plans for ourselves, we don't typically live in a bubble. So if we are taking time for you, that might mean that there might be less time maybe with others or doing things for others. So sometimes thinking about, well, what needs, requests, or expectations would you like to share with other people? And who would you like to tell, maybe, and when? So is this, oh, I want to let my partner know that I'm going to need coverage for things at home or with another family member on this date, or just letting your kiddos know that, hey, I'm not going to be around for dinner tonight. I'm actually going out to do X, Y, or Z. Just help set expectations so people don't think that you wandered off, and you're lost and need to be found. But really also just is a nice way to model how to be collaborative and respectful with others, especially when you are doing something different and just changing that dynamic or ensuring that you have the support to be able to do what you'd like to do. And you can think about also how communicating clearly could help you practice self-care in and of itself. So I'm going to start a poll in just a moment, kind of asking a little bit about, you know, who has ever felt guilty about taking time for yourself? This is anonymous, by the way. So this is either yes, you felt guilty at some point, maybe lots of times, maybe never, or no, you've never felt guilty, and that's fine too. We're just trying to get a little bit of the lay of the land about how people feel about this idea of self-care or taking time for you. And we'll give people a few more seconds. And in the meantime, someone in the chat had said, be compassionate to myself. That's something that can help carve out self-care time. Okay, so I'm gonna end the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, so our results are that 88% of our respondents tonight have said that yes, they have felt guilty about taking time for themselves. And only 12% said no, they've never felt guilty. And, someone else just shared in the chat, treat yourself like you would your best friend. Gosh, that's excellent advice. I really appreciate that. So here we can start to think about, well, what else can we do if it is hard to take care of yourself? In addition to that perspective taking, we can also think about situations that have come up with some family members that I've worked with around travel, for instance. Summer's coming up. Sometimes people have vacations that they've already booked. Sometimes they just maybe want a night away, and they feel really worried about doing that. Or some people say that they haven't gone anywhere outside of their home overnight in years. And so for a situation like that, everyone's different, of course. We can ask ourselves whether it's for travel or, taking a few hours with your phone on do not disturb, for instance, what are you most concerned might happen? So use your best judgment. If the stakes are high and someone's in a real life or death situation right now, that's probably something that we wouldn't just want to allow to happen. It would make sense to step in, intervene, or be available to support someone. That being said, if what we're most concerned about happening is something that is uncomfortable, but not life-threatening, or is a negative consequence that, could have longer-term repercussions, we can think for ourselves, well, all right, that could happen. And also what is most likely to happen. So of all the possibilities, are there alternative outcomes that are actually more likely? Like maybe a relative might forget to do something. Well, how important is that thing that they might be forgetting? And so we can start to calibrate for ourselves, well, what's leading to the concern or stress about taking time for yourself, recalibrating and thinking, okay, realistically, what's most likely to occur? And then also think about what are the opportunities to empower folks to do things for themselves that would actually free you up mentally or literally to do things for you. So for instance, okay, what would we like others to do for themselves? Is it some of those things that we talked about in the other dilemma about trying to ask for people to get things done? And then what would happen if they didn't do some of those things? The answers are different depending on the situation, but also if someone really might need help, who else is available? Does it just have to be on you? Is there another family member who could help? Or if your loved one is in professional treatment, could that treatment team help and provide support here too? And then certainly last but not least here, we've got problem solving. Why is this a problem for you and right now? And remembering what are your options? So sometimes we think, oh, well, I maybe I'm a runner or a walker and I love taking hour-long strolls or mile-long outings, and I just can't do that right now. I have too much going on. So some of your options could be, maybe doing some of that, but maybe for a much shorter period of time, or maybe a different frequency than you used to. Or you can think about, all right, everything's a trade-off. Like what do you want to say yes to, and what are you okay temporarily saying no to? And then we can also think about, well, what goal setting guidelines would be most helpful? So sometimes we set high in the sky goals about self-care, like I want to do this new thing for myself every day. But the last time I did it was who knows when. So here we can be even more successful by taking time for ourselves by setting goals that we are 99% sure that we can achieve. So maybe it's doing something once. Maybe it's doing something for 10 minutes. Maybe those 5 or 10 minutes would be better than no minutes. And then also thinking back just to like that comment earlier about treating yourself like you would a best friend. Why do you deserve this time? Just like we might think, well, why does our loved one deserve love and support or professional care and all the success in the world? Because they're worth it. And you are too. Sometimes it's tough when we feel like we're trying to help everyone achieve all of the things at once. So reminding yourself why this is important, including the fact that taking care of ourselves as family members best positions ourselves to take care of others, can be a worthy reason as well. So now we're going to move into some resources and Q&A. So I just want to highlight that we do have a number of McLean resources for family support groups, other people who have gone through similar things. I also want to highlight that we do have something new coming up, our Wellness Recovery Action Plan, or WRAP, for families with one of our certified peer specialists, Lisa McLaughlin-Charland, starting in June. It might actually overlap with this webinar a little bit, but it's going to be Thursdays, 5:30, oops, that should be 6:30 p.m. Starting June 6th. So if you are interested, feel free to get in touch with her at lcharland@mgb.org. Okay. And then we also have some additional books based in craft or informed by craft if you're interested for additional reading. And then there's a great nonprofit called the Partnership to End Addiction that has wonderful online resources about craft. Craft is something that came from the substance use field, so it really focuses a lot in the wild on substance use, and also can be really valuable skills, honestly, for anyone. And so they have great information on craft, but also no cost coaching from family members trained in craft as well. And I think you can get several free phone calls or text support around that as well. We also have a resource based in Massachusetts called Allies in Recovery, which is a number of services from online courses to kind of a membership support group. And actually for certain states, including Massachusetts, you can have access to membership for free, I believe. So feel free to check this out. And we also have something called the Foundation for Change that I've had some interaction with myself that has taken craft and adapted it to include a bit of acceptance, more explicit motivational interviewing, and they offer some different support group listings on their page, some of which are also at no cost as well. And this is a nonprofit organization, Foundation for Change. And then we also have We the Village, which we have a bit of a relationship with as a fellow NIDA awardee in terms of developing craft in a digital format and really testing how well it's helping people right now. And so there's an online course there that is available for a fee. And then we also have NAMI Family to Family as another option that many of the folks that we work with have found helpful in terms of a free educational session for families, really taught by families just like you and I, and helping people think about how to support their loved one in their recovery, generally not specific to any one particular diagnosis. And then Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance does not necessarily have craft skills at the moment, but they do have a well-established and growing network of support for both people with lived experience with psychosis and family members as well. All right, so before we get to closing remarks, I'm just going to check out the chat to see if there are any questions for Q&A before we wrap up for tonight. Okay, yeah, so someone had written in talking about interest in the resources and wanting to access some of those. So let me actually put our resource list in the chat. I believe the ones that I had mentioned live are in this resource list, and shout out, thank you to a couple of our attendees last month who had reminded me to include one of the resources on the list. So I've updated that and this should be current as of today. So if anyone has trouble getting that PDF that I had just put in the chat, please let me know and I'd be happy to send it along as well. Okay, let's see. Okay, great. So someone put in the Q&A, Schizophrenia Family Support Group. Yes, there are lots of different options, whether it be some at McLean, in the community. And so the list that I've included includes a lot of McLean specific resources, but then also local, regional, and national resources as well for folks. So what questions, if any, do people have about craft or specific dilemmas that your family have encountered or are experiencing at the moment? And I'd be happy to answer or to kind of think through together how to maybe approach those situations. Okay, so one question was, what was the craft book in the resources? Yes, let me bring that back up because I went through a little bit quickly there. Okay, so for the books, the one on the left, the Craft Treatment Manual for Substance Use Problems, is geared a little bit more to providers or people who would be offering or teaching craft skills to other people. So maybe clinicians, facilitators, people along those lines. What's geared more toward the public, family members and whatnot, would be Get Your Loved Ones Sober, Alternatives to Nagging, Pleading, or Threatening, written by Dr. Robert Myers, who is one of the people who developed craft. And a very similar book, a little bit newer, I believe, is Beyond Addiction. This is also a wonderful book written by the folks at the Foundation for Change, and it kind of summarizes the craft skills that we've touched on today and is a wonderful resource for families as well. The last one is I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help, written by Javier Amador, and he's writing from the perspective of a clinician, but also someone who had a brother with schizophrenia. And some of the information that he shares in what he calls his LEAP approach is informed by craft as well, but is a little bit different too. So great question. Okay, yes. And someone else had prompted me to mention the YouTube videos again. So yes, we definitely have YouTube videos that can be great references that go a little bit more in depth into many of the craft skills that I've mentioned tonight. And let me see if I can put that in the chat for all of you if you are interested. So this will be the link for any past recordings, but then also any future recordings we would put on this website as well. Okay, here we go. All right, and then another question was, what would you suggest for borderline personality disorder and bipolar mental health? Great question. So for borderline personality disorder, there's an evidence-based approach called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, that is highly recommended for people with bipolar disorder. And so these days, lots of people tend to have access, if you're in a treatment setting, at least like McLean or in the community, many people are familiar with DBT skills. And so that can be something that can be a helpful approach for people to engage in when you're interested in covering some of these topics that are core to DBT. Interpersonal effectiveness, which is a whole communication module for DBT. Mindfulness, which is very foundational in terms of how people think and are aware and intentional about what the state of their life is like and what is the most effective course of action to pursue, as well as distress tolerance, kind of thinking about crisis survival strategies in the moment, and then also longer term distress tolerance strategies, and then thinking about emotion regulation. So how can we think about, kind of, as we've mentioned in this craft discussion, getting ourselves to a place where we can manage those emotions. All of our emotions are important, even if they're uncomfortable sometimes, to be able to communicate and engage in our goal-directed behavior as we would like to. So that being said, when we have bipolar disorder, that's a little bit different. Many people can benefit from all types of interventions. For bipolar disorder, I would definitely look for folks who are using a cognitive behavioral approach and or DBT approach, and really thinking about how we as family members might be able to help someone experiencing bipolar disorder. Honestly, I think a lot of the craft skills that we've discussed could apply as well. So the first pilot program where we had looked at craft for early psychosis and substance use, half of the loved ones with psychosis had bipolar disorder with psychotic features. And all of those family members found it quite helpful. So I would say from a family member perspective, this could also be potentially helpful there. Let's see. So another question that we have is, let's see. Okay, our family, of course, wants our loved one to get the highest level of care the fastest, definitely. But our loved one is not anywhere near interested in that level of treatment. How do we reconcile that difference and work toward a middle ground? Wonderful question. So first, doing the research legwork, if you haven't done so already, is key, because craft would recommend, in an ideal world, which I understand is not always possible, if a loved one says, I'm ready, like I'll meet with that person, I'll give them 5 minutes or I'll meet with them once, whatever it is, ideally getting them in the door to have that appointment within 48 hours is recommended, because like any of us, we might feel like doing something one day and not so much the next. So trying to have your ducks lined up in a row so you know what your options are, what insurance coverage, if any, you might have for that person, what the availability is, knowing that yes, your loved one might need to make the move to actually attest that they want that intervention, can help go a long way. Another wonderful option that I recommend to a lot of families who have a loved one that's not ready to seek formal care is see if they might be willing to talk to a peer specialist. What I mean by that is someone who is trained to work with other people with mental health conditions who they themselves have their own lived experience with mental health too. So we have a whole section in the resource PDF that I had handed out featuring different peer specialists who work at McLean Hospital, at least. For folks who have loved ones, I think up to maybe age 30, with early psychosis at least, they would be eligible for what's called our well-spaced groups run by our peer specialists like Steve Fideli and Lisa McLaughlin-Charland, and that's at no cost to folks. There are groups that they offer. They can do one-on-one support. They can meet, for vocational counseling. And so meeting with a peer specialist can be an excellent foot in the door to just thinking about getting some support with moving closer toward whatever your loved one's recovery goals are. even in the absence of formal treatment. And also they can be exposed to what treatment options are available. So thank you for that question. All right, another question was what is the best way to find a therapist that offers DBT? Great question. There's a resource called Psychology Today. I don't have any affiliation with them, but they have a directory online listing a lot of therapists that list their specialties. And you can search for your area, who takes insurance, who doesn't take insurance, and that could be one option to start. Let's see, somebody else writes in, my son spends all his time in the backyard shed, which he made into a comfortable place. He comes in only to eat, use the bathroom, or sleep. He shows BPD characteristics, but refuses to learn DBT, saying his brain doesn't work that way. Sure. So let's see. I think that here you're seeing a need, he's seeing a different need. And so I think there we might be able to think about, well, all right, what is most important to him? Kind of going back to thinking, well, all right, what does he care about? Let's understand his perspective, because one of the motivational hooks in craft is to appeal to what the other person thinks is important, and knowing that, you know, treatment isn't just one way or the highway. Treatment really is meant to be what we call person-centered or tailored to that individual's needs. So I would try to maybe talk to him about what he thinks he's looking for. If it's not DBT, that's okay. There are other options too. All right, somebody else says, I keep running into roadblocks with HIPAA. Any suggestions? One thing to know is if you know who the clinician is, you always have permission to give information, even if you're not allowed to receive information. That being said, if you contact a loved one's clinician, they have the right, or depending on their practice, may automatically share that contact with your loved one. So in order to be transparent about that, sometimes you might want to have a heads up conversation with your loved one first, or just know that that might happen. To get in contact with a peer specialist, Steve Fideli's email, Lisa McLaughlin and Charlin's emails are in the PDF that I had sent out. If you're in Massachusetts, the Kiva Centers is the statewide kind of peer specialist organization that certifies all the folks who work with us. And yes, that would also cover the WellSpace group peer specialist that someone just asked about. So unfortunately, we are out of time for tonight. So I would just want to point your attention to our closing remarks slides. Just a moment, here we go. So we can put in the poll real quick, if you have a second, if you like, which craft skills you would want to practice this week. And while you're filling out that poll, I'll just put another plug for that feedback survey. Please feel free to fill that out. It would really help us make sure that we're meeting your needs. And I'd just like to thank everyone who has made this project possible. And our next webinar is the second Thursday in June, 5 to 6 p.m., Recovery with Peer Specialists, actually with Steve Fideli, who runs WellSpace. So if anyone has questions for him, you will be able to talk with him more next month. And so thank you so much. My contact information is up here, and I look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you.